Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Got a very special guest in the studio today. My old friend, Group Captain, now retired, Clive Montellier, who is the head of the Ministry of Defence Joint Casualty and Compassionate Centre.
That's right.
JCCC, in other words. Based not a million miles away from where we're sat now at Innsworth. Is it still RAF Innsworth?
No, it's ever since 2008, it ceased to be RAF Innsworth then, and now headquarters of the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps at Imgin Barracks.
Imgin, of course.
Good history of Gloucester.
So, there we are. And what we're doing is we've done a series of videos on the channel about this perhaps somewhat surprising, confusing, upsetting scenario that there are Battle of Britain and other aircrew have been left buried at their crash sites, particularly in southern England, and recovered by amateur enthusiasts largely over the years since George Drake, the first one, I think was 1972. And we've covered all of those digs and the chronology of how we've got to today, and the Ministry of Defence's position, which is really one of non-disturbance and letting sleeping dogs lie, I suppose. So, in the interests of a rounded investigation into all of this, I think it's only right and proper that the Ministry has an opportunity to explain its position. So, thank you very much to Clive for coming in, and I'm just going to let Clive talk now, really, because I'm so interested in the things we've talked about over the years, and particularly the last few weeks when we've been thinking about doing this. So over to you, Clive.
Thank you very much, Dilip. But I should say it's a great pleasure to come in on this series of videos that you made, which are really interesting and massively comprehensive. I should say for the viewers, I've got a few notes in front of me here. I'm not reading from the script, but I did want to make sure that having talked about it with you, I sort of went through this in some sort of logical way from start to finish. And I just want to say up front that I am acutely conscious that we're discussing the violent death of young men, and indeed occasionally women, in the service of their country, with all the impact on their families that entails. Now, I'm unashamedly going to talk in terms of the brutal reality of dealing with the aftermath of those deaths. And I apologise in advance if anybody watching finds that uncomfortable, but I think that comes from a deep respect from those who have paid the ultimate sacrifice in the service of their nation. So let me put this into context. You mentioned, yes, this is part of the Joint Casualty and Compassionate Centre work, falls under the commemorations team, as we call it, and it's linked to our responsibility for the identification and burial of historic remains of UK service personnel from World War I onwards, discovered worldwide. So really, that's everything from First World War through to Korea, the last time we left your unknown remains behind. So we need to put Protection of Military Remains Act, or POMRA, as we all call it, and the control it places over human remains within the UK in the context of something around 350,000 missing UK service personnel from the world wars worldwide. And I think the need to apply a consistent approach to that. So what is the UK's policy? Well, since the end of active recovery in the wake of World War I and, of course, World War II, when both world wars picked up activity again, the UK's approach has been to respect the sites where remains are believed to be present, effectively treating them as war graves, although that's not an official designation other than in some specific cases, and recover only where the circumstances dictate or where they're discovered accidentally. And that's a lot of what my team do, is working in the aftermath of where stuff has come to light in France, Belgium, more widely, where a French farmer has gone to build a new barn and found some remains that are believed to be British there. So the UK's policy is that we don't carry out speculative recovery, be that one of the missing few, or a private soldier lost in the carnage of the First World War, or Italy, or anywhere else. And I think that consistent treatment is really important. I completely understand that some families would welcome, really welcome, the prospect of recovering the remains of lost family members, but others might not, or we might not be in a position to ask them. And we need to apply an approach that maintain an approach that applies to every historic casualty worldwide. And I think it's also worth highlighting how that mirrors the approach taken in commemoration and the concept of equality of death reflected in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and the cemeteries that we all visit. Well, there's no differentiation on the grounds of rank or family background, or indeed the circumstances of an individual's death. The hero is buried alongside the individual who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time on the wrong day. So back to POMRA and how we apply it. I mean, you've talked in your videos, how POMRA was introduced in 1986 to prevent the unlicensed recovery in the UK of human remains. It covers sites at sea and on land. My team principally responsible for the on-land element. So we're talking about aircraft sites within the UK. It talks generically about military remains, clues in the title. But our focus in JCCC, like everything we do, is about the protection of human remains. Though the protection of the sites, where they may be present. Because the likelihood of munitions is also a factor. Really important factor, because it's about the safety of both those carrying out the dig and anybody in the vicinity. But I know today we're very much focused on the people, be it the few, be it anybody. The cases we see, I think, fall into three overall categories. The easy ones are where the crew survived or perhaps subsequently died in hospital. It's safe to presume that they're clear of human remains. Perhaps also relatively easy are where the crew were never recovered, and we have to presume that they're still present at the site. I think for my team, and I know some of the cases we've worked together on, the really difficult cases are where crew members died in the crash, they were given a grave, but contemporary records don't provide any evidence of any kind of assessment at the scene or what the recovery of the bodies looked like. There's sometimes clues in the language that suggest the cause of death was genuinely assessed rather than put down generically. So if we see something like major trauma or multiple injuries, that doesn't tell us a lot. That tells us that somebody died in a crash. Where, for instance, a medical officer writes something in the casualty record that actually tells us that to write that, he must have actually been inspecting somebody who was either dead or dying, then we can presume that body was actually removed from the site for them to be able to do so. Sadly, the other thing that we have to recognise that some of the contemporary communication with families might have erred on the side of sensitivity, quite rightly. So that a family, having been told that their loved one was recovered and buried, and that's been passed down through generations, might not tell the whole story. So, a grave is not proof in itself. Our sources, files held in the National Archive, casualty files, of course, but anything else we can pull out, and I know you look at those as well. Anything held by the Air Historical Branch, again, sort of stuff that you're very familiar with. Commonwealth War Graves Commission records, and of course anything else in the other nations equivalent. So we won't stop at British records if there's other nations involved. I think it's really important to say we'll consider evidence put forward by the applicant as well. This is not a closed shop whereby we look at your application, our records say that, and we're not interested in what you found. And I've seen cases where the applicant has managed to unearth contemporary reports as to the nature of the crash, like an eyewitness account, which might suggest, for instance, that the wreckage stayed on the surface and that consequently any human remains would have been recovered at the same time that the site was cleared. I mean, of course, that kind of also makes it unlikely that an excavation is going to find anything, but actually that doesn't matter in terms of our assessment of the case. We're solely focused on, could there be human remains there, not is this likely to be a successful archaeological excavation. I'm not there to judge that.
No, indeed. And I think a point that I would make early on in this particular video is that I don't, and I haven't invited you here to do this, is to justify things that have gone on, long before you came into this particular job. I mean, you can't hold people responsible for things that happened in 1976, for example. So the purpose of the exercise, it isn't that at all. But I think it is very interesting to hear from the horse's mouth how the Protection of Military Remains Act is applied. And there is a video a few videos back, which is all about the Protection of Military Remains Act, which explains the mechanics of it. So now we've got the application of it, and that's very interesting. So yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad you say that, but I mean, actually, since I've been in the job for 5 years or so now, and I have looked back at lots of the past cases, you know, and actually I found, to blow smoke, I found your book really interesting, looking at it from the other perspective and trying to understand, okay, what was going through the minds of my predecessors, you know, when those cases were done? What were we looking at, and how would that play out if I was looking at that today?
I think, yeah, I mean, to comment on that, you know, and having been around this, as you know, for a very long time now, you know, people feel extremely strongly about it, to the extent that they're prepared to take law into their own hands in the past, go to court and take whatever's coming their way. So, and it's possibly, you know, kind of strange thing in a way that you are JCCC, and there's that word compassion in there. Because there is no doubt that if you look at some of those cases and the way that the family's wishes have been dismissed, there's not a lot of compassion there. So it's a bit ironic, really, you might think.
I think there's a link there to, as I said, some of the sort of UK national commemoration policy, and sort of getting into huge history thing. I always look back to the work of Fabian Ware in setting up the Commonwealth, the Imperial War Graves Commission, of course, as it was, and that concept of democracy and equality in death, and those cases in the wake of the First World War and indeed the Second, where you had a lot of families who wanted to bring home their sons, inevitably sons. You know, they're all young men out there, but the Imperial War Graves policy was that all would be treated the same, irrespective of what a family, a particular family, might want or indeed be able to do, because so much at that time depended on wealth.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
So yes, it's one of those things where there is ultimately no right or wrong. I think everybody has a view, and we respect the view.
That's right. Yeah.
One of the things that makes it slightly, I wouldn't say awkward, but throws something in that that sort of runs against it, is that we have to recognise there'll be external factors like major infrastructure projects. That might be housing, roads, wind turbines, in some of the remote areas, that will drive a managed recovery where an archaeological or heritage activity alone wouldn't justify the grant of a licence. That I think is something that it often would look quite strange to somebody where perhaps you want to dig because of the archaeological heritage element of it, and we can't, but because somebody wants to drive a road through, actually we can't stop that road happening. Now, POMRA isn't really helpful in defining that. But again, it does mirror the approach to UK casualties worldwide. I've just come back from France, burying nearly 50 Scottish infantrymen whose bodies were recovered when a new hospital was being created.
Yes, I saw that.
So I think people probably knew that there were human remains in that particular field. But it wasn't until there was an infrastructure driver to go and clear that field that actually it was done. So again, there's that consistency there. One thing we don't do, again, in the whole process, is take into account the merits of any potential development in terms of the impact on heritage. Because once or twice, we've been approached to say, could we prevent the development so as to leave a site, a particular area unturned? And of course, that's the planning process. We would take care of that heritage element. We wouldn't try and overlay that and say no, don't build there because of what happened there. That's planning, not POMRA. Likewise, our consideration of POMRA application isn't affected by factors such as the status of the applicant. So to us, all applicants are equal. We don't grade applicants by virtue of their experience or any subjective weight we might put on that. The significance of the aircraft, the crew, or the family involved, or whether the crash occurred in training or combat. Our sole duty is to protect the remains of the fallen from disturbance unless unavoidable.
Right.
So it's a kind of an equitable approach.
Yeah, I get that. I understand that. But what we're saying is that the casualties are will be dealt with if they are disturbed accidentally or there is a danger of the site being destroyed because of development or whatever else. But what interests me particularly, and I actually got halfway through a PhD on this, and I must pick it up again sometime. Got an alphabet after my name, but I could do with those two letters in front sometime. But the Dutch are extremely proactive in seeking out the missing. You know, we've talked about this many times. And here at Jonker and his team at Sosterberg, you know, I've been to the lab there. It's absolutely fascinating. They have again, talk about equality. You know, I mean, they are focused on whoever the casualty is, whether it's Czech, Polish, Dutch, British, American, German, doesn't matter. Civilian servicemen, you know, they think it's a debt of honour to do this, to proactively recover. So that's one approach. Then you've got the Germans are pretty much the same these days. Now they've got access to the Eastern Front. I think the last time I spoke to them, they were talking about recovering about 30,000 remains every year, with no sign of that figure reducing very much over the next few years. Absolutely staggering. And repatriating them to the fatherland. Then we've got the Americans that even have a smart monthly target, I'm led to believe, as only the Americans would, to recover their war dead from all over the globe, really. And then what's happening in Russia is particularly interesting, I think. A friend of mine, Olga Ishneva, who's a BBC World Service reporter, Olga was telling me that a lot of these excavations on the Eastern Front, it was started back in the 70s, I think it was, it might have been earlier than that, where university students were used during summer holidays to help start clearing the battlefields and just, you know, and find the dead. And it did two things. It made them aware of the scale of loss, and it also imbued in them from an early age patriotism and nationalism. And in fact, you know, in Russia, they say that what Putin has done is creating this mythical past where Russia was united against the common enemy. You know, Russia's never been united, has it? I mean, it's too big a country anyway. But all of that is quite fascinating and extremely proactive. And we're not, are we?
No, it's funny.
That's the thing.
It's the very next point.
Right.
Got it here. So
Okay.
yeah, clearly on the
Brilliant.
same wavelength. Yeah. I was to say that the policy of other nations, both within their own borders and indeed for their casualties who fell in the UK. I'm talking primarily about US Army Air Force. You know, they do apply a different way. And there was a point, of course, after the two world wars, where the British authorities were working closely with the authorities in these nations in the active recovery of the war dead. And there are some fascinating books about the process of recovering war dead from the areas around the Somme and Ypres.
For
So
sure.
I'm not sure exactly at what point the UK national policy sort of moved to one of allowing the fallen to lie rather than speculatively recovering them, and going after each one where there's a clue that there might be somebody in a particular area.
Because I think that's the key to this, really, that people don't understand. It just seems so heartless, really, to just have that blanket approach of equality, as you describe it. You know, whereas I suppose a lot of us feel, and I do feel, that it should be on a case-by-case basis, that sometimes there is compelling evidence that would suggest that that human remains do exist at a particular place. And to me, I mean, we've ended up talking about the missing few Battle of Britain pilots, you know, but it's not really just about Battle of Britain pilots, it's about anybody. You know, that's the point. But a case-by-case basis, examining all of that, and maybe whether it was, and it has happened, hasn't it, where we've had official recoveries, the RAF have done it, so on and so forth, you know. And I think that's what vexes people a great deal, that there is this, you know.
And it's hard to put your finger on exactly at what point that changed. I mean, as an amateur historian, I can only I can only, in my own mind, put it down to that sense of equality in death. That if
not money.
if you can't go looking for all of them, is it right to go looking for some?
I mean, this is it. You know, my great grandfather, Herbert Smith, is missing from Gallipoli, 4th Battalion, Worcestershire Regiment. You know, and I mean, my view of that is that I think there's 20,000 names on the Hellies Memorial to the missing. There are 10,000 unknown burials on the peninsula, but it would be ridiculous of me to say, oh, well, I want a DNA test of all 10,000 graves to see if any one of those is my great granddad. That would be absurd, ridiculous. But then where we've got some of these other cases where you talk about one pilot, say, and all the compelling evidence, that's what we don't understand. Why, and you're not responsible for this anyway. I mean, as we've already said, you know, we're talking about things out a long time ago. And in fact, we're going to do another video next about a particular case, Flight Sergeant Eric Williams, of where we are with that licensing. So that's an interesting point. So we'll maybe leave that point a little bit, and we'll talk about it later.
That's a good example to use.
That I think it isn't maybe as cut and dried today as it has been in the past, because I think you're prepared to be flexible over things if the evidence is sufficiently compelling.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's a theme that goes with everything we do.
That is the big change. Yeah, sorry, anyway.
That's kind of the lead up to the grant of the license. I thought it was just also worth refreshing what happens after the license is granted.
Can we just talk about one thing?
Yeah.
For example, I know of a Spitfire that crashed in the northeast. I've got a particular interest in. I think it's from what we can gather, it's a bit of a surface crack anyway. You know? And somebody said to me, well, can I just go up there with a metal detector and have a quick look round to see if there is anything there? And if there is anything there, then apply for a license. But it doesn't work like that, does it?
Well, that's a really good question, actually, because it's one of the points I'd marked down. Right. So my approach to metal detecting, of course, metal detecting is covered by its own legislation. Yeah. So, somebody can't just go metal detecting without permission to do so. But that's not governed by POMRA, that's its own legislation. Yeah. My approach to metal detecting would be, if somebody wanted to do surface metal detecting and had permissions to do so, then there would be no problem. POMRA does not prevent that. It would be disturbing a potential site. Equally, if somebody wanted to use a good metal detector to try and narrow down the site for a potential license application, again, I'd have absolutely no difficulty with that. I think where suddenly you would be into POMRA territory is if somebody said, oh, well, I've done some metal detecting, there might be something here, so I'll do a bit of digging to find out, and then I'll put it up, because that would be a test dig, so that is covered by POMRA. Yeah. They say that has to be licensed because you don't know how far down somebody would go before disturbing remains.
So if somebody just had a bit of a metal detector sweep around a crash site, and there was beep, 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 but they didn't dig anything up, is that okay?
So long as they had permission from the landowner, and there were no other.
Say that's a given,
Yeah, I would see that in the same way as somebody carrying out a ground penetrating radar. So I think there's a site I want to apply to dig on here, and I'm carrying out a ground survey to know, so I can tie down my license and say I want the license for that grid reference there. And that's where I'm going to go and dig for this particular aircraft. So if it doesn't involve disturbance of the site, and it's within whatever legislation is there to control metal detecting, that does not
take note of that, because there's a lot of misinformation floating around out there, and that's why I wanted to hear it from the horse's mouth. So you can go and have not a poke about, but you can go and have a bit of a metal. If it's and it looks promising, then you could apply for your license.
Right. So license is granted. Hopefully the dig takes place. Now, in terms of anything that's found, the presumption is that any aircraft parts, equipment, manuals, etc., if they survived, remain the property of the MOD. And they'll be listed on the return that we ask all applicants to make to us. Now, the reality is that they're likely to be released to the applicant if not required by the RAF Museum. And certainly this isn't JCCC business. We're into people, not bits. Any personal items recovered remain the property of the next of kin, of course. And they come back to us in JCCC, who will attempt to reunite them. in exactly the same way as we would for a casualty that happened yesterday. If human remains are recovered. Now, either because this is what I think of as a force majeure, an infrastructure project. So we've granted a license to dig with the possibility that remains might be there. Or, indeed, if the evidence that we've got proves to be misleading, then obviously recovery must be conducted with the appropriate authorities, so police and the coroner. But then, in concert with the police, we would then use our SOPs for commemorations, including DNA analysis, if required, to positively identify those remains wherever possible. And then, in every case, we formally inter those remains in either a new or existing grave, as appropriate, with a ceremony involving the next of kin, if one existed. So, the follow-up is quite logical. It's what you would expect to happen, and would look very much like what we would do for that private soldier recovered in France or Belgium. The other thing I thought really important to cover is, what if any of us think that somebody is breaking the law? If somebody's out there and digging where they have no license. Of course, the responsibility lies with the police and Crown Prosecution Service to investigate and then to decide whether to prosecute. But what we've been doing a lot of in the last couple of years is working with Historic England as part of their heritage crime prevention strategy to raise awareness, especially in areas of concentration for aircraft crashes. So the police forces in those areas understand POMRA, understand how it fits in with stealing lead from church roofs, that kind of heritage crime, and they kind of know where the rules sit and know who to come to in terms of advice. I mean, I think, for me, ultimately, the responsibility lies with all of us who have an interest in this world, be it aviation heritage experts, archaeologists, we on our side, to report any suspected infringements. How can we encourage people to do the right thing if we collectively don't try and highlight where people are doing the wrong thing? Illegal activity could just as easily occur on a site where there's been no license application as one where there had. And indeed, if you were planning to do something illegal, would you actually highlight the potential for it by putting in a license you knew you were going to get turned down for? I don't think I would. Whereas all sites are protected by the Act. What we do also is, wherever the police are investigating, then they'll clearly engage with us, and we will provide the requisite evidence as to what licenses have been in play for that particular site, whether approved or not. So we'll always be providing evidence. But I think that's key, because I think for the community to feel that there is equity in us doing the right thing, all of us, you've got to feel that, okay, what if others do the wrong thing? How can we band together to make sure that we protect the proper way of doing things? So other bits and pieces. Well, we talked about metal detecting. I think there's sometimes a misconception that digging is allowed to plough depth. I've seen that phrase come in.
I don't know where that's come from.
I think that comes from the fact that we're often talking about agricultural land. And this will have been worked many, many times since those crashes happened. And obviously, POMRA didn't seek to protect that. But as we were talking about with metal detecting, clearly if something's on the surface or amongst the loose earth on the surface, then that's not disturbing the site. But the minute one starts getting a shovel out and starts digging, then how do you differentiate between disturbance of the site that deep and 20 feet? And the other thing I did want to mention, somebody said to me once, should we charge a fee for this? Should we actually try and professionalise this and try and deter the casual applicant? And I think, for me, that's something I wouldn't welcome. Two reasons. One, this is part of my duty, to administer the law in respecting UK casualties worldwide. And I wouldn't ever want somebody to perceive that we were somehow monetising an element of the military covenant. This we do because it's our duty to respect those who fell. But I think the other reason, a very practical one, is we need to encourage legitimate applicants to come forward and have their applications assessed on the basis of the likelihood of there being human remains, and then, if not, to actually carry out the dig on its own merits. I think if we made people pay to get that license, then we might inadvertently encourage unlicensed test digging. We talked about that. Somebody going out to confirm that a license would be worth the cost. So I'd almost be making it more difficult.
Encouraging night hawking almost.
And you make it more difficult for people to do the right thing, and that for me would be wrong. So ultimately, one of my key messages for people actually who might be thinking about this: one, apply in good time, and do include any background evidence that people have amassed. We really respect that community out there, and we're interested in what they found out. So this isn't just limited to what we know is in the archives. We want to see what people have got to bring to the party. Obviously, be definitive about the location and the aircraft involved. It's really hard to work out the likelihood of being human remains if it's too broad, or it's any aircraft that might have crashed in this area. The sort of work you've been involved in, that's really, really definitive. Hurricane X number on this date in this place. That's what we're looking for. Seek the landowner's permission, of course. It'll be required in every case, and be prepared to obtain separate permission from the local heritage authorities. That's the part of the process.
But that is not legally binding, is it? That bit isn't. That's not part of POMRA. That's something.
That's not part of. That's part of the local authority planning.
Because my experience of the local heritage is it's a complete and utter waste of time, frankly. And at the end of the day, it's people like us who have been involved in aviation archaeology for 40 or 50 years that have got the knowledge and the experience, not the beardie from the local council's archaeological team who hasn't got the faintest clue about what a piece of Messerschmitt 109 would look like, or anything else, And I think that's something that started to very much frustrate people. And in fact, the last license I had, I think, was that Spitfire at Dimmock. And I sent, at your request, a detailed report to the local archaeologist. I didn't even get a reply. Absolute waste of time. And I'm a busy man, and I had to spend time doing that. And I was virtually on the verge of making a complaint, really, because it's just not on. And that is something that I think, I've got to say, Clive, I think that bit's a bit of a cheat to tack that on, because it isn't legally binding. That's something the MOD have come up with. I can appreciate the need to try and professionalise this, but I also feel that you can't get a degree in aviation archaeology, unfortunately. Now, I know people, without mentioning any names, but people who've been involved in this, as I say, for 50 years now, they're massively experienced. And just because you've got a degree in archaeology and dusting off old Iron Age pots and things like that, why does that give that person more status and gravitas than somebody who's been digging up crashed aircraft for 50 years? It's bonkers.
Well, I have to say, you make me think I must go and look at just how we phrase that, because for me, this is not about us placing a requirement on somebody. It's making people aware that there may be other local regulations they have to take into account, so as not to mislead them that having granted them a license under POMRA, that then gives them carte blanche to crack on, and it will take care of everything. So for me, it's not about us imposing something. It's about making people aware that there may be local restrictions that they need to comply with, so as not to lead them into the position where they're digging away merrily, and then suddenly somebody comes to the local authority and gives them a telling off.
No, that makes sense.
I've got my license from the MOD. I thought it would all be fine. So,
no, that makes sense. I do understand that. And indeed, when we did the Messerschmitt 109 near Livingston, it must be 10 years ago now. I think I liaised with some heritage organisation in Southampton, and they just had no interest in it. But equally, they could have said, well, actually, there's a Roman villa, on the same site. So I said, okay, I understand that bit,
And I think it's that sort of making sure that we help people tie the bits together, so that we can give you a licence sort of in terms of the military aspect of it, but that doesn't give you landowners
Yeah.
permission.
No.
It doesn't give you local authority permission. So those bits need to come together. And I think that's really the point I'd come round to. It brings up several of the things we've been talking about. We've got a huge respect for the expertise of the aviation heritage and archaeological community. There are people that know far more about individual aircraft, individual campaigns, etc., across the span of what we do than we could ever know. Our job, and I think the thing I really feel is incumbent on me, is to be absolutely impartial in that discharge of the legal duty under POMRA to protect the remains of the fallen. So if we have to decline an application, it's not criticism of the applicant's professional standing, their research, their reasons for applying. We're not questioning somebody's rationale or their motivation. Just the fact that our national policy is one of allowing the historic fallen to remain undisturbed, and that's what I always come back down to. That's the bottom line, isn't it? That's what I'm. So once that has been satisfied, then I'm then content to pass this back into the field of the archaeologist and the heritage to use all their expertise to get the most they possibly can out of their site.
In fairness, it is a very complex subject, and I can see that if you've got, for example, I mean, we roughly pretty much know now how many of the few, for example, the missing few, are out there still. And I've probably spoken about them in the previous video, I think. Probably about 4, I think. So it's not like the situation in the 70s where suddenly George Drake is recovered and people thinking, oh my God, how many are there? And there was a gathering sort of frequency of this happening as we went over the next decade, I suppose, which must have been very worrying for the ministry because financial implications, apart from anything else, could have been hundreds, who knows? But now there isn't. There's only a very small number. And I guess that the get out of jail card is if there was an operation to recover one of those, even though that's narrowed down just to those 1 or 2 or whatever, it still causes a problem to somebody, for example, who's got a relative missing in Arnhem, where there are lots of missing still. And I've been involved in that, as you know. So I suppose it is actually very complicated, isn't it? You're never going to come up with a solution that's going to suit everybody.
So I think what you say there is really important because there might be say 4 few, but what about the ones that were killed 2 months later? Or indeed the ones that killed in training accidents. The bomber crews that were out on an exercise and something went wrong and are still out there somewhere, perhaps. Exactly. They might be less prominent in the sort of national story in terms of their specific endeavour, but in terms of the impact on the next of kin and their part in the whole story of the nation at conflict, where would you draw the line in saying those we go after, those we don't? And that's where I come from. There's sort of there's 350,000 of our young, sometimes not so young, men and indeed women out there. Some will never ever be found. They're at the bottom of the sea. They're in parts of the world where, or there may be nothing to find. But to go looking for one means that should we go looking for all?
Well, I think it's a great conversation, Clive, that we've had. It's an extremely complex, emotive subject, very, very, very complicated, looking at all the different aspects and angles and so on and so forth. And I think people are going to find what we've talked about very interesting. The way that you've explained it and the MOD stance today, that I think can be perhaps a bit more flexible than once it was, and we're going to talk about that in the next video. So I hope you found it helpful, interesting. Leave any comments below. Always interested in feedback. Join the conversation, and by all means, please subscribe to the channel. I think we've probably got 91 videos and podcasts, all Battle Britain related, available now, and it's all free. So there's nothing not to like. So keep tuned. So next week we'll have the next video online. And thanks for watching, and thanks for coming in again.
Thank you, Dilip.
Thank you.